The yellow wallpaper is, like Poe's Fall of the House of Usher, another work within the Gothic, but specifically American Gothic genre. Yellow Wallpaper was written by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who was an American feminist author in the late 19th century. Again, like Fall of the House of Usher, the Yellow Wallpaper has a fairly simple plot. The story, also written in a diary-like first-person perspective, follows the narrative of an unnamed woman who is recovering from what we might assume to be postpartum depression in a countryside colonial home that she and her husband have rented over the summer. Her husband John is also a physician, and he has prescribed her to go on a rest cure for what he identifies as her hysteria. Throughout the course of the story, the narrator becomes obsessed with the decaying yellow wallpaper in the nursery room to which she is confined. Eventually, she begins to see the figure of a woman in the design, and she believes she must liberate her. Eventually, she comes to think of herself as the woman trapped behind the wallpaper. What sets the yellow wallpaper apart from Poe's story is that it fits within a subgenre of Gothic literature known as the female Gothic. Although texts in the female Gothic tradition also rely upon many traditional Gothic aesthetic and thematic elements, ruins, castles, forms of monstrosity, transgression, insanity, and excess, it mobilizes these elements to suggest critiques of socio-historical gender politics. As literary critic Ellen Moore states, the female Gothic codes in part the expression of women's fears of entrapment within the domestic and within the female body, especially as they are most terrifyingly experienced in childbirth. In this way, the female Gothic serves to articulate women's dissatisfactions with patriarchal society and addresses the problematic position of the maternal within that society. In other words, the female Gothic genre uses many of the recognizable aesthetic and thematic elements of the Gothic to reveal specifically the terrors experienced by women, such as those, like in the case of the yellow wallpaper, as a result of, for example, their sexuality or will, or lack thereof, to uphold traditional gender norms and constructs. First, we might note that the setting of the story and the significance of some details we might initially overlook. The spatial frames presented to us most frequently are those of the nursery with the yellow wallpaper and the garden the narrator observes through the window. However, in her description of the colonial home itself, Gilman does offer a number of significant details about the space that help make visible the gendered critique she offers. For example, consider the moment when the narrator asks John to remove the wallpaper and he refuses. She states on page 4, he said that after the wallpaper was changed, it would be the heavy bedstead, and then the barred windows, and then the gate at the head of the stairs, and so on. At first glance, these details seem just to describe various details of the home. But what do these details really suggest? All of these spaces the narrator describes suggest possible routes for escape or liberation. If she were no longer confined to the bed, she would be able to move about freely. If the bars were removed from the windows, she'd be able to visualize her escape. If the gate at the head of the stairs, the front door, were changed, she might be able to leave the house altogether. Details like these mobilize a particular description of the space that creates a mood of entrapment and oppression, the traditional Gothic spatial frame being used to create an underlying feeling of anxiety or terror, much like the descriptions of the Usher house do. In other words, one might wonder, what exactly is the haunted and creepy force that makes the house and the nursery so awful? Is it something inherent to the structure itself, or what the structure comes to signify? In this way, like in the Fall of the House of Usher, yellow wallpaper is also suggests, as I mentioned earlier, a way of looking at the world that is redolent of something other than itself. While this is indeed suggested through the descriptive details I just discussed, think also of the fact that the narrator is an unreliable narrator, meaning that while the narration is given in first person, Gilman offers details that suggest that the narrator may not be credible in her accounting of events. This may be offered through the voice of the narrator or the style in which they speak. It may also be suggested by their making plainly false or unrealistic claims. Perhaps the most explicit detail that makes the narrator in the yellow wallpaper unreliable is the fact that as the story progresses, she stops distinguishing at times between herself and the woman she sees as being trapped behind the wallpaper. On page 16, for instance, she asks herself when speaking of all the creeping women she sees in the wallpaper, "I wonder if they all come out of that wallpaper as I did." Another element that suggests her unreliability may be the fact that she skips around between subjects in ways that seem irrational or illogical. What is the significance of these details? What assumptions do they make us believe? What assumptions make us believe that what she is saying cannot be trusted, and what socio-historical contexts help us understand the significance of these assumptions? Why might we consider the narrator of Fall of the House of Usher to be reliable, but not the narrator of the Yellow Wallpaper? And do we? Before you begin analyzing this story, it is important, as Zach mentioned last week in his lecture about setting, to consider context. Gilman wrote this story during the late 19th century, which was a time in which women were actively discouraged from writing, perhaps because of a patriarchal fear of defiance. At this time, women who deviated from the gender norms of the domestic sphere were often thought to be hysterical. In fact, medical diagnoses of female hysteria often had to do with what a male-dominated society and medical profession believed to be improper female sexual desire, rebellious behavior, and paranoia. While it is widely recognized today that female hysteria is not an actual mental illness, it is important to consider how Gilman uses the figure of John to reveal the dehumanizing and even monstrous aspects of a male-dominated society and medical profession that seeks to confine women and prevent them from engaging in any seemingly deviant behavior. She captures this tension through the narrator's voice. While the narrator speaks lovingly of John, her affectionate descriptions of him suggest an underlying oppressive darkness. He prevents her from writing, from talking with others, from expressing her thoughts, and even from moving her body without permission. The effect this has on the narrator, of course, is that it does seemingly force her into a kind of madness reminiscent of themes of terror, powerlessness, paranoia, and nervousness in all Gothic literature. How do knowing these contexts help us to think differently about the significance of the yellow wallpaper and the nursery to which the narrator is confined? Before concluding this lecture, I want to touch upon our last text for this week, Shirley Jackson's The Lottery. Although it can be argued that The Lottery does not fit the female Gothic tradition, it does share some similarities to the yellow wallpaper in that it offers, through its mobilization of certain aesthetic and thematic elements of the Gothic genre, a kind of social and cultural commentary. One might argue, for example, that The Lottery emphasizes the darker and more sinister elements of community, family, and tradition, ending finally with the sacrifice of a woman and a mother. Knowing what we know about Gothic literature and its generic aesthetic and thematic elements, then, how do we make sense of Jackson's The Lottery? As you write your discussion post this week, I'd like you to offer your own thoughts and analyses of this text. Feel free also to point out similarities and differences in the way all three texts conceive of the Gothic. That's all for this week. See you next week.